Learn Math page for section 2.3 on congruent segments. They give us some key terms in this box. For number 1, they want you to complete each sentence. So we're just going to read this geometry. Segment AB is congruent to segment AB because congruence of segments is reflexive. That's when you compare one thing with itself. If two segments are congruent, then they have the same length. If point A is between point X and point Y, and the distance from X to A equals the distance from A to Y, then A is the midpoint of segment XY. If segment AB is congruent to segment CD, and segment CD is congruent to segment EF, then segment AB is congruent to segment EF because congruence of segments is transitive. A segment has one midpoint. If you want to bisect a segment using a construction, you can use a straight edge and a compass. That's this guy. Number 2, read each definition. Write the definition as two different if-then statements. So, definition of congruent segments. You could refer to your text on page 62 if you have one of those. If you don't, they tell you what congruent means up here. Congruent segments have the same length. So you could say if two segments are congruent, then they have the same length. What's another one? Well, if two segments have the same length, then they are congruent. That's its converse. It means the same thing as it. Good definitions, the converse and the conditional, have the same meaning. Definition of midpoint. What is a midpoint? Well, a midpoint is going to split a segment into two congruent segments. So, if a point is a midpoint, then it splits a segment into two congruent pieces. Converse of that is going to mean the same thing. You could say if a point splits a segment into two congruent segments, then that point is a midpoint. Number 3, a segment GH, has a midpoint M. And we know the distance from G to M is an expression, 6x minus 8. And distance from point M to point H is this expression, 4x. Find the value of x and explain the steps you use to find the value. Well, if point M is the midpoint, then these lengths are equal. So maybe we could put a step even before that. We could say distance from M to H equals distance from G to M. How do you know? M is the midpoint. So those two lengths must be the same. Then you can solve. So we'll subtract 6x from both sides. And then we'll divide by -2. X is 4. Some problems will ask you to plug that value back in here, but they didn't. They just ask you to find x.